A festive glow radiated from the Johnson family's home, the vibrance of their Christmas decorations drawing mixed reactions across Brighton Hills. The multicolored lights framed their house like a kaleidoscope, while the tall Christmas star illuminated the yard in a celestial shimmer. Unique accents with African-American motifs, hand-carved figurines of joyous family scenes, Kent cloth-patterned wreaths, and bold garlands made from traditional African colors stood out amidst the sea of typical suburban decor. Sarah Brooks, the long-standing chairman of the HOA, scowled as she walked her dog past the house. To her, Brighton Hills stood for uniformity, a sanctuary of good old American values, as she liked to put it during her frequent speeches at HOA meetings. The Johnsons' display wasn't just loud. It was a breach of the community's unwritten rules about cultural expression, rules that, in reality, targeted anything that didn't fit Brighton Hills' predominantly white, conservative aesthetic. That evening, a plain note was taped to the Johnsons' door. Written in bold, impersonal letters, it read, "These decorations violate HOA guidelines. Remove them immediately or face fines." The next morning, Patricia Johnson spotted the note while sipping her coffee on the porch. Her hands shook, but she set her jaw and called her husband, Marcus. "This," she said, handing him the note, "is what we're dealing with." Marcus, a lawyer, carefully scanned the HOA's guidelines, stored in the thick booklet they received upon moving in. Nowhere did it explicitly forbid the type of decorations they'd put up. "Unwritten rules," Marcus muttered, his voice heavy with frustration. "They'll hide behind their vagueness." Patricia decided to post a picture of the note on the neighborhood's online forum, captioning it with, "Can someone explain what rules we're breaking? Our family celebrates Christmas like this to honor our culture. What's wrong with that?" The forum erupted. A flood of comments followed, splitting the community into factions. One camp, led by Sarah's supporters, insisted the Johnsons were disrupting the neighborhood's character. Subtle but cutting phrases like "keep it traditional" and "this isn't the place for that kind of thing" peppered the thread. The insinuations were clear. The opposing camp, largely younger families, rallied around the Johnsons. "This is a free country," wrote one neighbor, "and their decorations are beautiful. What's the real issue here?" By nightfall, Sarah herself chimed in, posting, "As the HOA chair, I must prioritize the community's cohesion. The Johnsons' decorations, though well-intentioned, do not align with our values of understated elegance. Rules are rules." The Johnsons chose not to respond directly but planned their next move. 2 days later, Patricia and Marcus hosted an open house. They invited their neighbors to view the decorations up close and enjoy some hot cocoa and cookies. The evening was both warm and tense, as attendees seemed equally curious and judgmental. Sarah showed up, her smile thin and her compliments perfunctory. "It's very festive," she said, her eyes darting toward the African-inspired ornaments. "But I hope you understand why some may find it unorthodox." "I'm sorry," Marcus replied, his tone measured. "But does unorthodox mean unwelcome? Because our decorations are well within the guidelines." The room grew quiet. Sarah's face darkened as she realized her attempts to maintain control were failing. Days later, Marcus submitted a formal complaint to the HOA board, demanding clarity on their enforcement policies. Meanwhile, other families in Brighton Hills began adorning their homes with non-traditional decorations in a show of solidarity. The neighborhood's pristine uniformity began to dissolve, and the board faced growing pressure. Sarah, who had long used the HOA as her personal power platform, found herself besieged by questions about her leadership. Rumors swirled that Sarah had expressed private disdain for the Johnsons even before the holidays, referring to them as disruptive newcomers. A leaked audio recording confirmed it, igniting calls for her resignation. By the time Christmas arrived, Brighton Hills had transformed. The Johnsons' yard became the centerpiece of the neighborhood's celebrations, with families from all backgrounds gathering to take pictures and share stories. Sarah's power waned, her once unquestionable authority reduced to whispers of scorn and pity. For Marcus and Patricia, the victory wasn't just about decorations. It was a statement. Their culture, their family, and their joy had a rightful place in Brighton Hills. The Johnson family chose to ignore the stern note. Instead of dwelling on negativity, Patricia focused on preparing for their holiday dinner, her kitchen filled with the warm scent of cinnamon, nutmeg, and roasting turkey. Marcus hung additional ornaments on their indoor tree while their two children, Maya and Jacob, played outside under the dazzling lights of the yard. Unbeknownst to them, Sarah Brooks was watching from her living room window, her face flushed with anger. To her, their defiance wasn't just about decorations. It was a challenge to her authority. "They think they can mock the rules," she muttered to herself. Fueled by self-righteousness, Sarah decided to escalate the matter. That evening, Sarah waited until the Johnsons were seated for dinner, their laughter carrying through the neighborhood. The sight of their vibrant lights and cultural decorations had drawn the admiration of passing neighbors, which only deepened Sarah's fury. She grabbed a pair of scissors, a trash bag, and her phone to document what she self-justified as necessary action. Under the cover of night, Sarah marched across the street. Her heart raced, not from fear, but from a heady mix of anger and adrenaline. She began tearing down the Johnsons' decorations with fervor, yanking down the hand-carved figurines and ripping apart the garlands. The strands of Kent-patterned ribbon that adorned the bushes were stuffed into her trash bag without care. She moved quickly but methodically, stomping on the delicate ornaments to ensure they were irreparable. Inside the Johnson home, Jacob ran to the window to check on a noise he heard. "Dad," he called, his voice trembling. "Someone's in the yard." Marcus rose from his seat and joined Jacob at the window. His jaw tightened as he saw Sarah dragging their toppled Christmas star across the yard, her movements lit by the twinkling remnants of their lights. "Stay inside," Marcus ordered firmly, stepping out into the cold. Patricia, sensing trouble, called after him but stayed with the children. "Sarah," Marcus shouted, his voice cutting through the quiet street. Sarah froze, her hands still gripping the trash bag. Slowly, she turned to face him, unashamed and defiant. "You left me no choice," she replied, her tone icy. "These decorations are against community guidelines, and I won't let you ruin Brighton Hills with this." She gestured toward the broken ornaments, her voice dripping with disdain. "This?" Marcus echoed, his temper barely in check. "You mean my family's culture? Our traditions? That's what you can't stand, isn't it?" "Don't twist this," Sarah snapped. "This is about rules. Standards. Respect for this community." "Standards?" Marcus stepped closer, his voice growing louder. "Whose standards? Because I've read your precious guidelines cover to cover, and there's nothing in them that bans cultural decorations. This isn't about rules, Sarah. This is about control, and your prejudice." By now, neighbors were peeking out from their windows, drawn by the commotion. Some stepped onto their porches, curious and wary. Among them were the Johnsons' allies, families who had admired the festive display and were growing increasingly uneasy with Sarah's behavior. Sarah straightened her shoulders, a smug expression crossing her face. "You can play the victim all you want, Marcus, but I won't apologize for enforcing what's best for this neighborhood." "What's best for this neighborhood?" Patricia interjected, stepping onto the porch despite Marcus's warning. "Sarah, you've humiliated my family, destroyed our property, and now you're standing here acting like you're some kind of savior? What gives you the right?" "The right?" Sarah's voice rose. "The right comes from living here for 20 years, from being part of the fabric of this community. You, on the other hand, waltz in with your outsider ways and expect us to cater to you." Patricia's hands clenched at her sides. "You mean our skin color, don't you? Just say it, Sarah. Be honest for once." A murmur spread through the growing crowd of neighbors. The tension was palpable, and Sarah's carefully constructed veneer began to crack. "This has nothing to do with race," Sarah yelled, her face red. "Don't make this about race. It's about keeping Brighton Hills the kind of place it's always been, a place with class." "Class," Marcus said, his voice bitter. "You mean a place where people like us aren't welcome?" The confrontation reached its peak when Maya, the Johnsons' 10-year-old daughter, stepped outside clutching a broken figurine, a gift from her late grandmother. Her wide eyes, filled with confusion and sadness, silenced the adults. "Why did you break this?" she asked Sarah softly, holding up the shattered piece. Sarah opened her mouth but found herself at a loss for words. The sight of the child, so innocent yet hurt, momentarily disarmed her. The neighbors watching began murmuring louder, their expressions shifting from curiosity to disapproval. One by one, neighbors began speaking up. "This isn't right, Sarah," one man called out. "They're just decorations. Why can't they celebrate their culture?" Another woman added. "It's beautiful." Realizing she was losing control of the situation, Sarah tried to regain her composure. "I'm doing this for everyone here. You'll thank me later when this neighborhood stays reputable." But her words fell flat. The crowd had turned against her, their whispers growing louder with condemnation. Someone pulled out their phone and began recording, the flash of the camera illuminating Sarah's now flustered face. Marcus took a deep breath, crouching to Maya's level. "Go back inside, sweetie," he said gently. "We'll fix it." Maya nodded and retreated to the house, her small figure disappearing into the warm glow of their home. The next morning, Patricia and Marcus found their yard bare but not silent. Neighbors had begun to replace the destroyed decorations with their own contributions, strings of lights, ornaments, and even handmade tributes to the Johnsons' African heritage. Sarah, on the other hand, found her inbox flooded with complaints demanding her resignation as HOA chair. The very community she claimed to protect had turned against her. For the Johnsons, the night marked a turning point. Their resolve to stand firm against prejudice only grew stronger, fortified by the neighbors who stood with them. And Brighton Hills, though still far from perfect, began to change in ways Sarah Brooks could no longer control. The black SUV's sleek frame reflected the twinkling remnants of the Johnsons' yard lights, now bare of their decorations. The vehicle stopped with a purposeful grace, drawing attention from the few remaining onlookers lingering after the previous night's confrontation. Sarah Brooks, seated in her bay window, clutched a mug of chamomile tea, her expression a blend of victory and unease. She watched as Elias Johnson stepped out, his polished suit and crisp demeanor exuding authority. Elias carried himself with a composed air, his features set in a mask of seriousness. He glanced briefly towards Sarah's window, his nod barely perceptible. The simple gesture sent a shiver of unease down her spine, though she quickly dismissed it as paranoia. Inside the Johnson house, Patricia greeted her husband with a tight embrace. "It's done," Elias said simply, his voice calm but resolute. Patricia stepped back, her face searching his. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, her voice wavering. "We've already stirred enough attention. What if?" Elias held up a hand, his expression softening. "It's not about revenge. It's about standing up for our family, for what's right. No one gets to humiliate us and walk away thinking there are no consequences." The next morning, Sarah's alarm blared, pulling her from a restless sleep. The events of the previous evening played on a loop in her mind, but she consoled herself with the thought that the HOA rules were upheld and the neighborhood order restored. After all, wasn't she just doing her job? Dressing sharply, Sarah prepared for her day as a senior project manager at ClearPath Corporation, a prestigious real estate firm. As she entered the office, a buzz of excitement rippled through her department. "Did you hear?" whispered a colleague as Sarah passed by. "They're announcing the new CEO today. Apparently, he's a big name." Sarah smirked to herself. Big name or not, he's walking into my domain, she thought. As the self-proclaimed backbone of her department, she prided herself on keeping things running smoothly. Minutes later, the employees were ushered into the conference room. The chatter died down as the HR director took the podium. "It's an honor to introduce our new CEO," she began, her voice filled with enthusiasm. "A visionary leader with a proven track record in driving innovation and excellence. Please welcome Mr. Elias Johnson." Sarah's stomach dropped as Elias strode confidently into the room. He was the same man who had locked eyes with her outside the Johnson residence just hours before. For a moment, she hoped against hope that it was a coincidence. But when his gaze swept over the room and briefly settled on her, the faintest flicker of recognition passed between them. Elias's opening speech was eloquent and commanding, but Sarah barely registered the words. Her mind raced, replaying every word she'd said to the Johnsons, every smug retort, and every destructive act. She remembered the way she dismissed them as outsiders, the disdain with which she treated their traditions. He knows, she thought, panic tightening her chest. He knows everything. As the meeting adjourned, employees gathered around Elias, eager to introduce themselves. Sarah hesitated, torn between maintaining her usual confidence and avoiding his gaze altogether. Finally, she approached him, her voice carefully neutral. "Welcome to ClearPath, Mr. Johnson," she said, extending her hand. Elias took it, his grip firm but his expression unreadable. "Thank you, Ms. Brooks. It's always interesting to see familiar faces in new settings." His tone was polite, but the subtle emphasis on familiar made Sarah's skin crawl. Over the next few weeks, Sarah's anxiety grew. Though Elias treated her professionally, she couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching her, waiting for her to slip up. Small inconveniences began to pile up. Her projects faced unusually intense scrutiny, her requests for resources were delayed, and her standing in meetings seemed diminished. Though Elias never directly targeted her, the unspoken tension was enough to erode her confidence. Meanwhile, the Johnson family thrived. News of Elias's new role spread through Brighton Hills, forcing even Sarah's staunchest allies in the HOA to reconsider their stance. Many neighbors, eager to curry favor with the influential new CEO, began openly supporting the Johnsons, complimenting their resilience and even expressing regret over the earlier controversy. Patricia and Marcus were gracious but reserved. They accepted the gestures with polite smiles, their focus remaining on their family and their principles. Maya and Jacob, once shy in the face of neighborhood hostility, now played freely in the yard, their laughter a symbol of triumph. The breaking point came during a critical company presentation. Sarah, eager to redeem herself, had poured weeks of effort into crafting a proposal for a multi-million-dollar development project. She presented with her usual confidence, but as she spoke, Elias's expression remained stony. When she finished, he leaned forward, his voice calm but cutting. "Ms. Brooks, while your proposal is thorough, it lacks innovation. I expected a more forward-thinking approach from someone of your experience." The room fell silent, the sting of his critique unmistakable. Sarah's face flushed as she stammered a response, but Elias had already moved on, addressing another team member. Later that day, Sarah confronted Elias in his office, her professional facade cracking. "Mr. Johnson, is there an issue between us?" she demanded. Elias looked up from his desk, his expression unreadable. "Issue?" he repeated. "I hold all my employees to the same standard, Ms. Brooks. If you feel otherwise, perhaps you should reflect on why." Sarah's indignation faltered. The unspoken weight of their shared history hung heavy in the air. By the end of the year, Sarah's once unshakable confidence had crumbled. The Johnsons, however, stood tall, their reputation in Brighton Hills and beyond solidified. Elias's quiet strength and Patricia's unyielding grace had reshaped not just their neighborhood but the perception of what it meant to belong. And Sarah Brooks, once the self-appointed gatekeeper of Brighton Hills, found herself on the outside, looking in. The conference room buzzed with energy as the employees of ClearPath Corporation gathered for the monthly leadership meeting. Sitting near the center, Sarah Brooks fidgeted with the pen in her hand, her nervousness masked by a carefully composed expression. She had spent the last few weeks trying to navigate the quiet but unmistakable shift in her professional environment since Elias Johnson's arrival. Elias stood at the head of the room, his commanding presence drawing everyone's attention. Dressed impeccably in a tailored suit, he radiated authority. He began the meeting with a calm but firm tone, his words measured yet powerful. "At ClearPath," he said, "we pride ourselves on fostering a culture of inclusion, diversity, and respect. These aren't just corporate buzzwords. They're values that define us, both as a company and as individuals." Sarah stiffened. The opening lines already felt uncomfortably close to her own transgressions. Elias continued, his gaze sweeping across the room, pausing just long enough to make Sarah feel like he was speaking directly to her. "Our actions, both big and small, reflect who we are. Small actions can amplify our integrity or expose our shortcomings. It's easy to champion equality in policy, but it's how we treat those around us that truly defines us." The room was silent, every word landing with weight. Sarah felt her cheeks flush, her mind racing back to the night she had torn down the Johnson family's decorations. The memory of her scornful words and brazen actions burned hot in her chest. Elias's voice lowered slightly, taking on an even more pointed tone. The choices we make, the respect we show, or fail to show, become a part of our legacy. Small actions speak louder than a resume. The words seemed to reverberate in the air. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she clutched her pen. Around her, colleagues nodded in agreement, oblivious to the personal significance those words carried for her. As the meeting concluded, Elias thanked everyone for their dedication and dismissed the group. Sarah had barely risen from her seat when his voice cut through the room. "Ms. Brooks, a moment of your time, please." Her heart sank. She glanced around, her colleagues casting curious glances before filing out. She followed Elias into his office, each step feeling heavier than the last. The door closed behind her with a soft but ominous click. "Have a seat," Elias said, motioning to a chair opposite his desk. He sat down, folding his hands on the polished wood surface. For a moment, he said nothing, letting the silence stretch between them. Sarah swallowed hard. "Is there something I can help you with, Mr. Johnson?" Elias tilted his head slightly, his gaze unyielding. "I'd like to discuss something you left behind," he said, reaching into a drawer. He pulled out a crumpled piece of paper and placed it on the desk between them. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. It was the note she had taped to the Johnsons' door weeks ago, the one demanding they remove their decorations. Her own handwriting stared back at her, every letter a glaring indictment. "This," Elias said, his voice steady, "found its way to me. I'm sure you recognize it." Sarah began, her voice faltering. "Mr. Johnson, I can explain." He held up a hand, silencing her. "There's no need to explain. The note speaks for itself. But what troubles me more, Ms. Brooks, are the actions that accompanied it." Sarah paled, her carefully constructed composure unraveling. "It was a misunderstanding," she stammered. "I was just trying to maintain neighborhood standards." "Standards?" Elias interrupted, his tone sharp. "Standards rooted in exclusion? Standards that justify targeting a family for celebrating their culture?" Sarah's voice dropped to a whisper. "I didn't mean for it to come across that way." "Intent doesn't erase impact," Elias said firmly. "Small actions speak louder than a resume, Ms. Brooks. Remember that?" The words from his earlier speech landed like a blow. Sarah's mind raced, searching for a way to salvage the situation, but the weight of her actions pressed down on her like a physical force. Elias leaned back in his chair, his gaze unwavering. "I believe in accountability, Ms. Brooks. Not just for my employees, but for everyone. That includes addressing behavior that undermines the principles we claim to uphold." The conversation ended with an ominous warning. "Consider this your opportunity to reflect and to do better. But understand, Ms. Brooks, that my patience has its limits." Sarah left his office feeling a mix of humiliation and dread. Her colleagues, unaware of what had transpired, offered her polite smiles as she returned to her desk, but she could barely meet their eyes. The shame of her actions, and the knowledge that they were now exposed, clung to her like a shadow. Over the following weeks, Sarah found herself increasingly isolated. The cracks in her professional reputation widened, as word of Elias's commitment to diversity spread through the company. Though he never publicly referenced their confrontation, Sarah couldn't escape the growing sense that her colleagues viewed her differently. Conversations grew quieter when she entered a room, and once friendly faces now held traces of skepticism. Meanwhile, the Johnson family's standing in Brighton Hills soared. Elias's reputation as a fair but uncompromising leader extended beyond Clearpath, earning him respect across the community. Neighbors who had once sided with Sarah now distanced themselves, eager to align with the Johnsons' growing influence. For Sarah, each day became a reminder of her fall from grace. The values she had publicly championed as an HOA chair were now the very principles that exposed her hypocrisy. And as Elias's words echoed in her mind, "Small actions speak louder than a resume," she realized that her actions had not only defined her but left an indelible stain she might never erase. The backlash began with a single tweet. A neighbor, disgusted by Sarah's actions, had recorded the night she tore down the Johnson family's decorations. The grainy video captured her vandalism in painful detail. The vicious way she ripped the Christmas star from its perch, stomped on the delicate ornaments, and stuffed the remnants into a trash bag. The video, accompanied by the caption, "This is what racism looks like in Brighton Hills," was posted online and quickly gained traction. Within hours, it went viral. Onlookers from around the world chimed in with outrage. "Unbelievable," wrote one commenter. "Imagine being so bitter that you destroy someone else's holiday decorations just because they're celebrating their culture." Others were harsher, calling for Sarah to be fired, ostracized, and even prosecuted. Sarah's phone began buzzing incessantly. At first, it was messages from acquaintances, some supportive, others probing her for an explanation. But as the video spread, the tone shifted. Strangers began flooding her inbox with vitriol. "You're a disgrace," one text read. Another message, more ominous, warned, "We know where you live." By mid-morning, Sarah's name had begun trending on social media. Hashtags like #CancelSarahBrooks and #JusticeForTheJohnsons were everywhere. Memes and videos mocking her spread like wildfire. One particularly popular clip spliced the footage of Sarah tearing down the decorations with audio of Christmas carolers singing, "You're a mean one, Mr. Grinch." Sarah, panicking, turned to her publicist, a friend she had once helped secure a position on the HOA board. Together, they crafted a statement, which she posted across her social media platforms. "I deeply regret my actions," the statement began. "It was never my intention to hurt or disrespect anyone. My actions that night were driven by a misunderstanding about community guidelines, not racism. I hope to learn from this experience and do better moving forward." The statement, however, only added fuel to the fire. "You hope to learn from this?" one user replied. "You're a grown woman. You should have already known better." Another comment, which garnered thousands of likes, read, "Misunderstanding? You destroyed their decorations like a raging lunatic. This isn't a misunderstanding. It's a hate crime." Her attempts to defend herself in interviews went no better. On a local news segment, Sarah sat stiffly across from the host, her makeup failing to mask the strain etched into her face. "Sarah," the host began, her tone both professional and cutting, "what do you say to those who believe your actions were racially motivated?" Sarah forced a tight smile. "I've always respected diversity," she replied, her voice wavering. "My actions were about maintaining neighborhood standards. I acted without malice." "But the video," the host interrupted, "shows you destroying culturally significant decorations. How do you reconcile that with your claim of respect?" Sarah faltered, her carefully rehearsed lines slipping away. "It wasn't meant to be about their culture," she stammered. "It was about following rules." The host raised an eyebrow. "Rules that don't actually exist, according to the HOA's guidelines." The audience, already skeptical, turned hostile. Clips from the interview were shared online, further solidifying Sarah's image as a woman out of touch and unapologetic. Meanwhile, the Johnson family became unwitting icons of resilience. News outlets reached out to Elias and Patricia, seeking their perspective. Patricia's response, calm and dignified, further endeared her to the public. "We never wanted this attention," she said in one interview. "We just wanted to celebrate the holidays in a way that reflects who we are." What happened was painful, but it's also shown us how much support and kindness exists in this community and beyond. Elias, true to his composed nature, used the platform to advocate for broader change. "This isn't just about one family or one neighborhood," he said during a televised panel discussion. "It's about recognizing the systemic biases that allow actions like these to feel permissible. We need to do better. Together." The Johnsons' grace only magnified the contrast with Sarah's floundering attempts at damage control. As days turned into weeks, Sarah's life unraveled. Her job at ClearPath became untenable. Though Elias refrained from directly addressing the viral video, his visible disappointment and the growing discontent among her colleagues created an atmosphere she couldn't endure. Co-workers avoided her in the halls, whispered about her in the break room, and subtly excluded her from meetings. The final blow came in the form of an email from HR, an official notice of termination. The reason cited was conduct unbecoming of a representative of ClearPath Corporation. Her personal life fared no better. Friends distanced themselves, some under the guise of needing time to process, others cutting ties outright. Even neighbors who had once rallied behind her as HOA chair now crossed the street to avoid her. The threatening messages persisted. Her phone became a source of constant anxiety, every buzz a reminder of the world's judgment. At night, Sarah would sit in her darkened living room, scrolling through the endless tide of online criticism, her tears blurring the screen. One evening, desperate for solace, Sarah decided to attend the next HOA meeting, hoping to reclaim some semblance of normalcy. But as she entered the community center, she was met with cold stares and whispers. The meeting began with a vote to elect a new chair, a vote Sarah wasn't even invited to participate in. By unanimous decision, Patricia Johnson was named the new head of the HOA. The applause that followed felt like a thunderclap, drowning out the shame that roared in Sarah's ears. She slipped out quietly, the weight of her humiliation pressing down on her like a physical force. By the end of the year, Sarah's house stood dark and empty, a stark contrast to the glowing warmth of the Johnsons' home across the street. Her departure was as quiet as her fall had been public. Brighton Hills, once a bastion of uniformity, had transformed. The Johnsons' decorations returned, grander and brighter than ever, serving as both a celebration and a symbol of change. For the first time, the neighborhood truly reflected the diversity of the families who lived there. And Sarah Brooks became a cautionary tale, a reminder that small actions, rooted in prejudice, can have consequences far louder and longer lasting than one ever expects. The storm brewing in Brighton Hills took an unexpected turn when an anonymous lawsuit was filed against the HOA. The lawsuit, quietly initiated by Charlie Walsh, a reclusive yet sharp-witted neighbor, accused the HOA of unfair practices and bias. The legal complaint cited instances of selective rule enforcement, including Sarah Brooks' handling of the Johnson family's decorations. The neighborhood buzzed with speculation. Though Charlie's name was not immediately revealed, whispers of his involvement spread. Known for keeping to himself, Charlie was a retired civil rights attorney, and his sudden action brought a wave of scrutiny to the HOA's operations. Local media caught wind of the story, casting Brighton Hills into an unflattering spotlight. Sarah Brooks, already reeling from the fallout of her public disgrace, now faced additional pressure. The lawsuit included a subpoena for HOA records, threatening to expose years of discriminatory practices that had been quietly swept under the rug. In the midst of the chaos, Elias Johnson made a surprising move. He reached out to Sarah, inviting her to a private meeting in his office. Sarah, worn down by the weeks of relentless criticism, reluctantly agreed, her nerves frayed but her pride stubbornly intact. As Sarah sat across from Elias, his calm demeanor unnerved her. He began without preamble. "Ms. Brooks, you have two options." She stiffened but said nothing, her gaze locked on his. "The first," Elias continued, "is to record a public apology to my family and the community. You'll acknowledge your mistakes and step down as HOA chair. The second option is resignation from this neighborhood and any position of influence you hold." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah's throat tightened. She began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll do the video." The video was filmed the following day. Seated before a simple backdrop, Sarah looked directly into the camera, her expression a mix of remorse and weariness. "I want to apologize to the Johnson family and to the community of Brighton Hills," she began, her voice trembling. "My actions were wrong. They were rooted in ignorance and prejudice, and I deeply regret the hurt I've caused. I have learned that words and actions have consequences, and I am committed to making amends." The video was released online and shared widely. While some remained skeptical of her sincerity, others saw the effort as a step toward accountability. Sarah followed through on her promise to resign as HOA chair, a position that was quickly filled by Patricia Johnson, whose election was met with widespread approval. Elias, however, wasn't finished. Recognizing the potential for transformation, he extended an unexpected olive branch to Sarah. He invited her to lead a corporate project at ClearPath focused on developing inclusion and equity training programs. At first, Sarah hesitated. The idea of stepping into a space so closely tied to her recent humiliation felt daunting. But Elias was persistent. "This is your chance," he told her, "to learn, to grow, and to contribute to something meaningful." Reluctantly, Sarah accepted. The project became a turning point. Sarah threw herself into the work, attending workshops, reading extensively, and consulting with experts in diversity and inclusion. She faced moments of discomfort, particularly when confronting her own biases, but over time, she began to see the world, and herself, differently. Colleagues who had once distanced themselves took notice of her efforts. Slowly, Sarah began to rebuild trust, not through grand gestures, but through consistent, genuine engagement. She led discussions on systemic bias, shared her own journey of reckoning, and worked tirelessly to create training programs that resonated with employees. In Brighton Hills, the neighborhood was undergoing its own transformation under Patricia's leadership. Monthly HOA meetings became open forums where residents could share ideas and voice concerns. The Johnson family took an active role, offering suggestions and organizing events that brought the community together. One of Elias's proposals was a holiday bazaar, a celebration that would reflect the diverse traditions of the neighborhood. The idea was embraced enthusiastically, with families volunteering to set up booths, share food, and decorate the community tree. As the day of the bazaar approached, Sarah found herself grappling with uncertainty. The thought of facing her neighbors at such a public event filled her with dread. Yet, something compelled her to participate. She purchased a set of ornaments, carefully selecting ones that represented unity and hope. When she arrived at the event, she lingered at the edges, watching as children played, neighbors laughed, and the Johnson family greeted attendees with warm smiles. The towering tree stood at the center, its branches adorned with decorations contributed by families across the neighborhood. "Ms. Brooks," Elias's voice broke through her hesitation. He approached her, his expression calm but inviting. "Join us." Sarah hesitated, clutching the box of ornaments. "I don't think I should." "Nonsense," Elias interrupted gently. "Everyone has a role in building a better community. Come." He led her to the tree, where Patricia stood holding a garland. As the crowd watched, Elias extended the garland to Sarah. "You should do the honors," he said. The weight of the moment settled on her. Taking the garland, she climbed the small ladder to the top of the tree, her hands trembling. As she draped it carefully around the highest branches, applause broke out among the crowd. For the first time in months, Sarah felt something she hadn't thought possible: relief. She stepped down, her eyes meeting Patricia's. The two women exchanged a small nod, a silent acknowledgement of the journey they had both undertaken.